Thank you for joining today. My name is Chris Jers. I'm a Vice President with Focal Point. I run our National Data Privacy and Cybersecurity practice. Also with me, Danelle Martinez. Danelle, if you'd like to just quick introduce yourself.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining. My name is Danelle Martinez. I'm a director at Focal Point as well, and I've had the opportunity to assess different privacy frameworks and different privacy programs, from working with privacy all the way to working with the third line of defense, which is audit, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Absolutely, thanks. So just quick lay of the land as we get through the presentation today. If you have any questions, please put them in the questions section of the dashboard, and we'll take those in turn and try to get to them towards the end of the presentation. Program is going to run about 45 minutes today with a 15-minute Q&A at the end. There will be a CPE issued for today, so you'll be responsible for answering, I believe, 2 or of the 3 questions that do pop up throughout the presentation, and again, attending the presentation from now until when we wrap up towards the top of the hour. And if there's anything else that comes up, please, again, drop it into the question dashboard and we will take a look at it. For anyone who doesn't know, Focal Point, we're a leading cybersecurity risk firm. We work with everyone from the middle market up through the Fortune 500, and we really have a very well integrated service portfolio that comprises of our cybersecurity, data privacy, cyber defense practices, workforce development, risk consulting, and of course, technology integration, where we do a lot of our identity and access management work. So today, to Danelle's point, we'll be speaking about building an enterprise privacy strategy, something that is very much top of mind nowadays as more and more privacy regulations come online. And more importantly, as not only other businesses increase their scrutiny on where their data is going and who they're sharing with, but also where the customers and the clients are starting to elevate their understanding and their perception of how data is being managed and used, and holding companies accountable for, how they say they're managing the information that they do receive. So just a quick look at the agenda for today. We'll go through the current data privacy landscape, how to build that enterprise strategy, portion spent on assessing the program, and then how to operationalize the strategy on the back of the assessment or on any other regulatory compliance requirements you may have. And so data privacy in the news, nothing new. More and more scrutiny coming down around information and data privacy practices over the past number of years. And one thing that we see is that, unlike maybe a HIPAA regulation, privacy itself has gone industry agnostic, where we have clients across finance, manufacturing, distribution, healthcare itself, retail, and telecom. Everyone has questions around data privacy. What can we do? What are we doing with the data? How are we managing it? Does that comply with regulations that are out there? And even more importantly to that point, organizational standards and practices, right? Are we doing what we say we can do on paper? And is that appropriate, based on the information we've been given and that we're entrusted with? So love this graphic here because it shows the disparate nature of data privacy as it stands in 2020 amongst all other things that we're dealing with this year. State level regulations, forthcoming regulations that are working their way through the different legislative bodies across the states, paired with the existing regulations that are out there, the Federal Trade Commission and other requirements that are out there. It's a very challenging landscape. So where we've been fielding more and more calls this year on, okay, we have this privacy regulation and this client in this country. How are we going to start to manage all of these cohesively, right, to increase the effectiveness and the efficiency of the privacy program, and how we're interacting and managing with all of these data elements that we're being entrusted with. And those really, manifest themselves as a number of cost drivers. So enforcement penalties and legal costs are a huge concern. How you're planning your incident response, how you're doing the compliance audits and your assessments, getting your governance in place as far as policy development, handling the vendor management, third-party risk management, things like that. And then more internal, how do we get our staff certified and trained, right? So they're aware of these privacy requirements and how to help us increase our knowledge transfer abilities within the organization. That, by way, leads to external support consultants like myself and Danelle and others, where we actually come and bring our experience and our certifications to the table to try to help think through these privacy concerns and challenges. And ultimately, again, what gets pinned back on investments in technology and the program itself to drive that operational efficiency and effectiveness. Another big move we've seen over the past year or so is actually privacy programs increasing their headcount, hiring in, bringing those skill sets out from the consultancies or from other industry segments to help bring that perspective to the table for the full-time employees as companies begin to consolidate their management of the privacy program. Something we hadn't seen in years past, but absolutely a growing trend today. And of course, data security, which supports and really underpins any privacy regulation. The security program has to be in place to help manage the controls that are required to meet the regulatory intent and really enforce the standards that any client, any company has actually put in place for privacy. And some of the factors for reducing the cost of compliance, again, a mature cybersecurity program, continuously reviewing, assessing, auditing your privacy practices just to make sure that you know where all the ingress and egress of data is occurring, the reasons why that data is entering the environment, how you're protecting it, managing it, and ultimately destroying it if that's where it goes. And again, that speaks to centralized program management. That really helps to drive the top-down view and includes everybody from potentially the board of directors through the audit committee all the way down to the first-line data users and the implementation of the program itself. Okay, first question here. What factors are driving more attention to your data privacy program capability of late? There'll be a number of responses that pop up. Please take a moment and choose as you wish. So we have the increased regulation, 75%, far and away the biggest driver, and that is not surprising at all. Again, back to the earlier point about how disparate the regulations are getting. On two of the biggest ones, GDPR and CCPA, certainly bring some financial penalties with them that garner increased attention. So not surprising at all. And we'll hopefully be able to chat through some of the concerns and actually more importantly, the solution that the enterprise strategy would bring when dealing with the different regulations.
Yeah, so what does it take to build an enterprise strategy, right? And why do we need to do that? And for anybody in the call familiar with Sarbanes-Oxley, we can kind of frame it through a similar perspective, right? How it all started from something new that was just a new regulation, and then how it morphed and it became a mature piece of organizational framework that could be applied across the whole organization. So as Chris mentioned earlier, about 43% of organizations are working to comply with between 2 and 5 privacy laws. What does it mean? So in general, everyone in the call probably is familiar with all these laws, and we know there is a lot of factors in common, but there is also obviously the differences amongst them. And then from that perspective, that means we need some organization. And from that point, 56% of the organizations are actually moving toward a single privacy strategy because of that situation. So if I have if I have to meet CCPA in GDPR, it makes more sense for me to align to an overall framework, a high-level framework, instead of trying to say, okay, what is the CCPA requirement? What is the GDPR requirement? And try to match them back up. So the idea is to choose a comprehensive and trusted framework that is critical to build a very cohesive strategy. So what do we mean by cohesive? Again, going back to coming from audit centric thinking, right? Can I build controls that align with my regulations in a way that I can find the common factors, and from there it's going to be a lot easier for me to create these controls, because the consideration is not the control in itself. The consideration is when I give this to what I'm going to call my control owner, or the person responsible to take care of that control, will I give them something that will be realistic in terms of what they can execute? And will it meet my requirements in terms of governance reporting and the ability to add metrics and measure how is that going on? So we've had the opportunity to start looking at the NIST Privacy Framework that was put together in a first version earlier this year. And we believe it contains building blocks for privacy protection. It can help organizations prioritize their privacy risks and outcomes and achieve privacy goals. And going back to what we're talking about Sarbanes-Oxley, we do believe that the NIST Privacy Framework meets very similar requirements as the popular COSO framework that is the most widely used by public organizations. And that gives us the recognition that this framework contains a good baseline to build up that full governance across the organization. So as we talk about building, right? So now we're going to move from building to assessing. So how can I assess the maturity of my organization? And obviously, I have to go and look inside of each of the pieces, right? And we're going to go through a case study that we performed earlier, and that way we can put it into perspective. But from the maturity is, the first thing is that I need to know, again, going back to the controls, right? And for anybody who's familiar with the NIST framework, and anybody who's not, I will suggest go online, find the framework and download. And as I was saying, it's going to be risk-based, controls-based. It's going to be very straightforward, very simple to follow. And all these controls are assigned to different buckets. So the buckets will be similar to the ones you see on the screen. And it all starts on privacy governance, right? So from the governance perspective is, do I have the privacy structure in place to make sure I can meet all of the other regulations? And then the NIST Privacy Framework, similar to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, is going to bring it down all the way to the different levels that we see that are requirements of meeting the expectations of a basic privacy program. And then from there, we can find that assessing. The benefit of the NIST framework, and I can tell from my experience, is I can assess the maturity of the organization realistically based on where they are. So I'm not going to go in, I'm going to assess your maturity based on GDPR, because I might get too much in the details, right? And then I'm leaving CCPA behind. So what NIST gives us the ability in general from an assessment perspective is, let's take a step back. Let's see where we are from a privacy landscape perspective. And then as we start digging deep into each of the controls, we can say, okay, I can see from privacy governance, regardless of the framework or the regulation you have to follow, you are a good spot from a maturity perspective. Okay, now that we can say that we feel comfortable of that situation, now let's get in the next level, right? And as we go deeper and deeper between the different privacy landscape regulations, we can kind of decide, do we want to look at it from a 10,000 feet perspective, or can we go all the way down to the basics? And so going back to what we were saying, the NIST Privacy Framework lays the foundation for compliance with key regulations. What does this mean? So going back to controls, and I'm going to keep mentioning controls, my experience, and I come from an audit-centric language. So I see everything risk and control. That's what I see, and that's how I visualize everything, right? And the privacy landscape is not different, right? I have a set of risks, and can I align controls that will mitigate those risks? The interesting thing of the privacy framework is from the get-go, we already have ability to map the NIST framework to each of the regulations. So we internally already have specific mappings from the regulations that you see in the screen and other general privacy regulations to the NIST privacy framework, in a way that now we can, going back to what I was saying earlier, we can look at it from a high-level perspective, and we know that if we have a NIST control that I can say is mapped to GDPR and CCPA, I can feel confident that at that level, the control will meet the requirements of both regulations. In that way, having that framework in place, I can organize how I want to look at it. The other big benefit that we see of the NIST privacy framework, and don't shoot the messenger, right? The NIST privacy framework is focused, it comes from NIST, right? So obviously, NIST, the old privacy landscape will have a big cybersecurity requirement, right? Cybersecurity, information security is a key piece of any privacy program, right? And the interesting thing is, obviously, we all have different information security frameworks, right? So some of them might use ISO, some of them might use CIS, some use NIST CSF, some use NIST 853. So we all have different ways to map cybersecurity. But from the perspective of the NIST privacy framework, if you have the opportunity to download, or if you already downloaded the framework, you will clearly see how they interconnect, which is a big benefit because keep in mind, right? So cybersecurity supports data privacy, right? And I think it's important to mention that because sometimes we forget. So if we have an encryption control, we forget that the encryption control from a cybersecurity perspective is there to support the privacy regulations, not the other way around. So we have to, from a privacy side, we have to baseline how the control should look like so we can give it to cybersecurity. And then now they can apply a cryptographic control across the organization based on the requirements from a privacy perspective. So if you're able to download, you will see the exact mapping between privacy and cybersecurity risks. And that way, if let's say that I use NIST CSF and I'm mapping my controls against NIST CSF, I can immediately map those back to the NIST Privacy Framework, which gives me a big benefit, right? So I don't have to go back and assess those. First and second, keep in mind, right? So even if I use ISO 27000, I still have mappings, right? So we do have mappings between all of these frameworks. So it's as easy as mapping ISO back to NIST Cyber. And then now from NIST Cyber, I can go back to my NIST Privacy and I can see the full picture again with the support from the cyber group. So in terms of what is a privacy maturity assessment approach, right? So this is in your screen, you can see a high level view of how the NIST is structured. So very similar to the cyber framework, right? Very similar. Everyone who knows the NIST CSF will see that it looks very similar. Everything has categories. And as I was saying, within the categories, we have the controls. So we can assess maturity across the inventory and mapping category from the perspective of the controls underlying that area. And then we can go back in there and say, okay, this is your maturity on an identity function from a privacy perspective. And as I was saying, we can go down, right? So depending on where we are in the control level, we can assess maturity of the control, we can assess maturity of the category, or we can do a high level assessment of maturity based on how we feel the organization looks like in terms of where we should see it. So going back to what I was saying earlier, right? So if I'm doing a baseline of the privacy landscape in my organization, the first thing I want to see is how does it look from a high level? So I might stay at the high level perspective in terms of the controls. And then that's going to be my report, right? So I can go back and say, from my report, I can see there are opportunities for improvement from a maturity perspective, regardless of the regulation that I have to abide by. And there's things that I need to work on. However, these areas seem more mature from a high level perspective, and I can get deeper into those.
Yeah, thank you for that, Danelle. Yep. So, so what we've done here at Focal Point is we've actually leveraged the NIST Privacy Framework as the engine that drives our maturity assessments with these three goals, right? We're going to assess our client's program, really address the key risks and streamline the operations. At least from an assessment perspective, we get a very good lay of the land as to what's happening currently, current state of documentation, controls, capabilities, right? Which obviously then informs a unified strategy for compliance. Data privacy is not something that's going to slow down. In fact, it's going to get more complex as more states come online with different regulations. The country itself at the federal level may eventually institute some kind of a full-on data privacy framework where everybody would be required, quote unquote, to abide by. But in the interim, it behooves the companies out there to really build that unified strategy, right? It's going to lead to better efficiency, better effectiveness of the program, better staffing, better investment opportunities. So the assessment, among other things, will help outline some of that strategy initially. And then there's other work to be done on the back of that. And to that point, again, using the NIST Privacy Framework as the engine, we've added in the generally accepted privacy principles and some of the regulatory language around HIPAA from mostly a breach perspective, as well as some of the other components that are really required of a privacy program around GDPR and CCPA. To Danelle's point, there are mappings. NIST is broad enough that it foundationally and fundamentally addresses the program activities you would need to have to abide by most of these regulations. And at the same time, it adds some flexibility because you can take into account how you do things to tell your data privacy story and how that bumps up against the regulation. And as our standard approach to these assessments, we have a planning phase where we send out document and interview requests. We outline the objectives and the scope, and then obviously set up a status reporting cadence so that everybody is informed where we stand on progress and things of that nature. The analysis is where most of the work takes place through the discovery sessions we set up, and then running that gap analysis against the NIST Privacy Framework, again, is that engine with the added, gap principles and some of the HIPAA and GDPR CCPA specifics that we bake into that. So another nice part about our assessments, again, we're not giving you a binary yes or no, you do this or you don't. We do add in the context of a maturity score. So that gives some fabric to pull on. Okay, where are we at today? We're a 1 or a 2 or a 3 on a 5-point scale for maturity for these components. Where do we need to be? That's ultimately going to help drive our investment opportunities. And again, puts us right into the remediation stage where, as part of our executive summary, we outline those goals for the privacy program. We typically like to stay within the 12 to 24-month remediation period. There's a lot that can change between now and then. So we try to get that strategy on a page for our clients and then have some really good workshops around prioritization, order of magnitude, and essentially a plan of attack on how to get the organization more mature from the capabilities that are already there, or to continue to implement and configure additional supporting controls as necessary and as needed based on the results of the assessment. To that point, standard deliverables, the mapping of the current program against the framework, in this case NIST, with some add-ons like GAP and HIPAA. We report on the identified processes, any inefficiencies that we uncover, as well as opportunities for improvement. Even if something is being done at a very high level, more often than not, there's an additional thing or two that can be done to make that control or that programmatic capability a little bit more inclusive. Establishing privacy maturity goals, you may not need to be a 5 on the 5-point scale. Maybe a 3 is good enough based on who you are and what data you're handling and your organizational risk tolerance. So we do bake that into our process. As mentioned, the roadmaps to maturity and the summary for the executive audiences. We have in the past produced a number of reports, one that's more at the operational level, and then maybe a more high-level report that's a little bit more suitable for an audit committee or a board of directors meeting. All right, second question of the presentation, is your organization using a framework for the management of your privacy program? And we'll just give a moment there to see what the responses look like. Okay, almost an even split there between those that are and those that are not. Okay, understand. So Danelle, if you don't mind, I'll lead off here and then turn it over to you. These slides, the next few that are coming up, are really meant to denote how the NIST framework does contemplate some of the requirements for GDPR and CCPA and other regulations. Not going to read completely into the text on each slide. However, from a viewing perspective, you can see that if we're speaking processing around GDPR across the Articles 6 and 7, NIST actually has a control that says policies, processes, procedures for authorizing data processing, et cetera, et cetera. So from that perspective, you can start to see the synergy between the framework being written broadly enough to account for some of the more foundational and fundamental requirements that some of these leading global privacy requirements have behind them.
And individual rights is a similar example. So as you can see, CCPA has specific requirements for individual rights. And as you can see, we have on the other side NIST controls that align with those. Obviously, as we were saying earlier, they will align at different levels, right? So depending on the level we're looking at is how we map it back into CCPA. But this is another example of how we can have controls that specifically connect with CCPA and other regulations.
Same privacy notices here, where mechanisms, at least in terms of NIST, are notices, internal or public reports for communicating the processing purposes, practices, associated privacy risks, et cetera. Again, these start to shed the light on the fundamental approaches that you need to take to govern the privacy program at the organization. They can be accounted for through the framework, but they absolutely relate back to those going privacy regulations that are out there and some of the requirements that are expected to be in place.
And then for PIAs, we're putting the Brazilics example too, so we can add a little bit of everything, and you see how even from that perspective also maps to a specific NIST control, where you can see the direct connection between the framework and the regulation. And we keep talking NIST because as we've been saying throughout this conversation, we feel NIST is a solid framework in terms of mapping to all of these regs.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And no different again for third-party management. We use HIPAA here as the example, but every regulation has a requirement that you know where your data is going, and more importantly, how you're flowing down the requirements, either your standards or those of your clients who are sharing data with you. And again, NIST contemplates that from the contracts perspective and how those protections are being passed down. So there. And from the operationalizing the strategy perspective, we love this slide. It's very, very busy, but it basically ends up being a privacy program on a page, privacy by design, and really walks through, again, some of the security capabilities that need to be in place. It contemplates privacy notices, breach notification processes, the training, of course, and awareness that underpin the program. One thing we've seen with each and every client that has undertaken a privacy maturity assessment this year and actually entered into the remediation phase, there are cultural changes that occur on the back of these assessments and where you start to target those investments. You're changing the way people operate, changing the operational practices at the highest and then some of the lowest levels. So that has an impact on what folks do on a day-to-day basis. Training, awareness, understanding as to why things are occurring typically pay the best dividends over time, because it really is a collaborative effort across the organization. It's not just something that comes down from on high. Folks need to get behind it. They need to have some skin in the game, and to help support the program going forward, you'll need everyone to be at least pulling in somewhat the same direction. And then things again like third-party risk management, data retention, which is another big one that's growing again, specifically at end of life for data. What is really occurring there? What capabilities do you say you have in place, and what are you actually able to do? Typically end up being two different things, but we want to know about the retention and destruction policies. And by way of that, again, minimization of data. Just take in what you need. Don't take in more. If you need 5 data fields, stick to those. Don't try to get 10, or if you are getting 10 fields, let the client know or let your internal stakeholders know that you have to slim down those exports or imports to better manage your risk exposure and things like that. So again, could spend an entire presentation just on this slide, just some food for thought. Happy to answer any questions that folks may have as we get towards the end of the presentation here.
And I'm going to say this again on purpose. Security supports privacy and not the other way around. I think we feel it's very important to say this because from my experience, what we've seen is a lot of times security takes even a leading role sometimes on some of the privacy areas. And yes, obviously they are your technical people, right? They are the ones who know what to do. They are the ones who own the technology, right? They are the ones who understand what it means for something to go from A to B, but they don't own these controls because although they might say, you might talk to a CISO and the CISO might say, well, I have best in class cryptographic controls, right? I'm going to put that as an example. And so you ask, what does that mean, right? He'll probably say, I'm using the best technologies out there, right? They're probably going to say, I'm abiding by the highest encryption standards that exist out there. But that's not the answer that you're looking for, right? From a privacy landscape, because it's a different perspective. So if we look at each of these areas, so let's start prevention, right? Policy management. We've seen from a policy perspective, when data privacy teams are not involved, what happens is these policies are aligned to information security frameworks or programs, and they might or they might not map and connect to your privacy requirements. So we, as the privacy assessors or the privacy people who are on the other side, we have to come back to security and recognize how this policy management connects to the specific requirements. Monitoring and response. We have plenty of discussions in terms of a security operations center, right? And what does it take for incident management? How does it take for reporting? What does it take for continuous monitoring? In my experience, one of the hardest part that information security and IT has is, what do you want me to monitor? What am I supposed to look at when I'm trying to find incidents or suspicious activity or potential situations where I'm not meeting regulations? Well, I might not know, right? Because I'm the CISO, my responsibility is keeping up with the technology, but I need that support to understand from a regulatory perspective and a privacy framework perspective, what am I looking at? Data security, we have another example where we talk about encryption a little bit. Retention is one of the areas that you always see. So if you ask information security, they'll say, well, I'll keep it until I'm asked to delete it, right? Because obviously, if I'm the owner of that data, I don't want it lost, right? But I have to meet data retention standards and requirements that the privacy framework is going to implement into my organization. Application security, we could go crazy on application security, right? And everything you need to do. So do I implement privacy by design? Do I implement cybersecurity by design? Well, the first question is, do I need to, right? Because obviously the answer should be yes, but at what level do I need to comply with it? Because it's gonna cost me significant amount of money or resources. And maybe because of the privacy framework I'm looking at doesn't have that deep requirement, I don't need to go back to that level. Endpoint security, as we think everyone is using, and now with COVID, right? We're all home, everyone is using all kinds of devices. So again, what is the requirements of these devices from a privacy framework? If I have email in my cell phone, am I at risk of going away from specific regulations? What if I lose it? Does that mean that that cell phone is going, or that smartphone will meet the requirements? Does it need to be encrypted, etc.? So I can make sure that I can meet those requirements. Network security in a similar way. So we have, and this is an interesting one, right? Because network security is, in my experience, is a combination of information security with the network operation teams, right? Because it's so deep and so specific, and it's the baseline protection, is the first line of defense against attacks. So now you not only have information security, but you have operation people that are actually involved in your controls. So you can imagine how can that go way different levels that you will anticipate or you expect. It will either get really tight to the point that you don't need to do it, to the other side where, well, you know, the network team controls it and they just think that it's good enough in terms of what they look at. And perimeter security, this is an interesting one. We have experience with clients where we come back and say, if the regulation says, if I have a data center, I need this type of perimeter controls. Guess what? We go to some places, they have some servers in there, and I open the door and the door is wide open, right? And then the answer is, well, that's not a data center. And I, well, you know, tomato, right? So it's very important to stay on top of those situations, because we need to be aligned specifically. And again, this is another example of a privacy framework requirement connecting directly into information security control.
Exactly right. Thanks, Danilo. Okay.
And we wanted to bring you a case study of an activity we did earlier where we used the NIST Privacy Framework in a way, as Chris was mentioning. Going back to the audit-centric, I like this approach a lot in terms of meeting the expectations of what I call entity level, right, or governance-based frameworks. We have the cybersecurity framework. We have the policies and standards framework. We have the risk management, training, information security controls, compliance. So if you look at from a perspective of a high level framework, you could map it back, and we had the opportunity to map back into COSO as well for everybody who knows that framework too. And NIST, we're able to map the NIST framework to COSO, which from our perspective means that from that high level perspective, it should meet those requirements. So how did it look? How did the case study look like? So we map these controls, the NIST controls, into different what we call control themes to make it easy to assess in terms of where we were. And then we're able to provide maturity at the control level. So as we went through the control, we stayed on a high level. This was a NIST, I want to say, high level validation in terms of the framework. And from there, we identified where the maturity looked like for each of those areas. And what this maturity assessment provided was we were able to generate a remediation roadmap, as Chris mentioned earlier. So this roadmap, we say, okay, we believe that you should focus on these activities. And in terms of the timeline, we try to stay in a perspective of, and again, coming from the audit framework, from the audit life, right? I talk about high, medium, or moderate and low risks every single day. And I don't necessarily like that from a maturity assessment. And I think that the way that we develop this framework, the way that we were able to execute with this example is, I don't want to tell you what is high risk or what is low risk, because first of all, as we're doing high level, the specific exercise here is kind of tell you where you are from a privacy landscape perspective. And two, everything is high risk, right? Don't ask me, because they're all high risk, they're all important. But what I can tell you is what I will do first and what I might do later, because either one supports the other, right? So if I need a privacy governance or a privacy charter, that's probably the first thing that I will do. And then from there, I will start going down into the specific requirements. And the interesting thing of this particular case study is we did not go, we discussed in terms of the regulatory frameworks with the legal teams and the privacy teams, but we stayed on high level. So this is not a GDPR-centric, CCPR-centric, or any of the other regulations that apply to this specific organization. We stay high level. So what we thought was the benefit is sharp focused on the objective in place instead of trying to get lost into the details of the regulations.
Yeah, I think it's a great point to know, to the earlier point even more, the assessment itself may breed out additional audits, right? More focused reviews, deeper dives, whereas this is an inch deep and a mile wide across the entirety of a program. If that's how it's scoped, we do have the ability then to tailor that approach further. And that's certainly an outcome we've seen plenty of, where we may deep dive on any number of topics to uncover more information. And instead of looking at just design, we start to venture into the effectiveness testing as well, which gives us some good metrics around how things are functioning, not just on paper, but actual in practice. So a number of different outcomes based on any assessment. All right. Wanted to close with just a few common findings that come out of the assessment phase, especially nowadays. Biggest one that we've been addressing this year as a practice has been around data governance. And that's because it really encompasses everything. Policy, both privacy and security, controls, and then all obviously ties back into the regulatory space. And that typically in and of itself is a root cause as far as data assets and repository identification, again, finding where the data resides, right? Where those structured and unstructured repositories are and what assets data finds itself on, because that essentially becomes your risk landscape, right? Because you have to, that's the entire environment, where the data is going to go, where it resides. That drives how you're going to govern policy. It drives how you're going to implement security controls. And again, underpins your overall data privacy or governance program. Through that, and another component of managing that data is the identity and access management space. Not just what you have, but who has access to it. Where and how are they able to access that data, move that data around? And as the data classification of, or the data classification of the elements goes up and up towards sensitive and critical, you would expect to see the amount of folks who have access to that information decrease. So we absolutely do look for that. Identity and access management, privilege access management, absolutely common findings within our assessment results. Individual rights or data subject rights requests. Again, if Chris was to email or write to your company and say, hey, I'd like to know what data you have on me. Where is it stored? What are you doing with it? Does it coincide with the original consent that I provided you some time back, or maybe in the immediate future here? You have to have answers for that nowadays, and all of the regulations on the right-hand side of the screen are as to why. You need to know, again, why you have that data, what you're doing with it. And if somebody does request that you do delete it, you can with confidence explain that you have deleted it, except for specific reasons where some other regulations may not allow you to delete it, but that's a completely different subject. And another going concern this year, as it has been in the recent past, around third-party risk management, not just knowing what you're doing within your own four walls, but also understanding who's interacting with or receiving or working with your data outside of those walls. And again, why they have it, how long they have it for, what they're doing with it, and essentially how you can claw that data back or get some assurance around their deletion of the data should it no longer be used or appropriate for the relationship that you're managing with that outsourced provider or client. Okay. The last question, what other data privacy topics would you like to hear about going forward? I'm going to give you just a moment or two to answer that. Okay. Perfect. Those are our trends for 2020, data governance and third-party risk management. So Danelle will have to spin up another presentation on both of those topics. Again, those are very common. And really more and more organizations are starting to take an enterprise look at data governance and TPRM, third-party risk management as well. But much work to be done as we go into next year and beyond across the stream. Okay. So.
And we have one question, Chris. And the question, and let me take a step first, and then I'll be curious to hear your thoughts. Sure. It's saying, are you saying the NIST Privacy Framework will also map to the ISO 27000? So let me take over before I answer. And the short answer in our perspective and experience will be yes. The tricky thing, obviously, ISO is a high-level framework compared to NIST cybersecurity. But we have developed those mappings between one and the other, and by nature, by having the mappings to the NIST Cyber Framework and NIST Privacy, technically I can map them back. Obviously, the devil is in the details because my controls might have different levels of depth. So that's but my short answer will be yes. So I'll be curious to hear your thoughts, Chris.
I would agree with you. The answer is yes. The mappings may not always be a one-to-one, but you're going to get to some level of commonality between all of these frameworks, all of the regulations. Again, they're basically regurgitating lots of the same capabilities and fundamental approaches. So yeah, there would be some level of mapping to nearly everything that's out there at this point. If not, we could absolutely perform it if NIST hasn't done it themselves. All right, we have a few minutes left, so if anybody has any additional questions for us, we'd love to hear them. You can send them through, and we'll address them in turn.
In the meantime, Chris, can we talk a little bit on the cost savings of having a framework in terms of the opportunities to kind of leverage and put together, use the same framework instead of having to abide by different ones?
Yeah, it's a good point because, again, as the regulatory landscape continues to shift, you're going to be in a position where you're constantly, if you're taking it from a regulatory only approach, and you're going to be chasing every new piece of legislation that comes out of either federal government, state legislators, or other countries. So again, because there is that commonality at the foundational level of what each of these requirements or the regulatory laws ask of the organization, building the program with either NIST or any other framework that you're really looking to put in place will help you become more agile, more efficient, more effective, because your organization is going to handle consents and authorizations usually the same way it would across the entire spectrum because you're doing your line of work, whereas the regulation is sort of a one-size-fits-all. your adherence to the regulation, how you're going to address the requirements are very centric to your organization, the data you're getting and what you're doing with it. So you'll have your fundamental organizational approach that will abide by the regulation, or if your internal standards are even more stringent, that's fine as well. We can use those as the guiding light. But it will absolutely make you more agile and more apt to adapt to anything new that comes out because you've already got a good lay of the land. You know the data you're interacting with and protecting. You know why you have it. You know how you're handling it. And you can apply that to any of the new regulations that come down the pike. So it absolutely works that way as well.
Great. And curious, coming from an audit world, so I'm probably companies are using OneTrust, Archer, some of those, so to start building the framework within their own GRC programs?
Yeah, it absolutely helps. Again, it guides, the solutions, whether it's a OneTrust, a Trust, or whatever you may be using, or Excel spreadsheets. We've seen that plenty of times. The framework will, again, help guide the inputs and outputs of that solution, whether it's GRC or just straight privacy related. And you'll get better use out of that tool, better effectiveness out of the tool, because it's not just around that solution. It's really the program that surrounds the solution and makes the solution work better. Implementing the solution will not make you better right out of the gate, right? You still need to have that focus on the program itself and what you're doing. And that will make the solution that much more effective because you're more effective at using it.
All right, we have another question. It says, we're seeing the audit firms push management for more cyber-related key SOX controls due to SEC guidance released over the past few years. Have you had any inquiries related to these and how the NIST framework can be leveraged to help management ensure that proper controls are in place, particularly in wire transfers, IDS patch management, vendor setup, and backup recovery?
You want to take a shot at that one?
Yeah, so definitely it's interesting how the SEC is, and we see how that's morphing, right? The SEC started, well, I want you to tell me what your cyber program looks like, right? And then public companies started giving boilerplate language, right? You could even read, you just replace the name, right? Because everyone is concerned. I don't want to add very specific details because it can go either way, right? And then so there wasn't a lot of guidance. As the SEC keeps providing more and more guidance into how these cyber frameworks or what kind of information do I need to tell, it's making it easier for organizations to polish that. From our experience, what we have seen is the boards obviously are super curious, and it's interesting how the conversations, I remember a few years ago, the conversation started, do I have cyber controls? Now, actually the board members are asking very interesting, smart questions, right? Because they are very concerned. They know this is a key area to ask around. And we see how the board, and particularly the audit committee, is very interested, and anything that is found in terms of these assessments or anything else, they look at them immediately because it's a key piece of all of the requirements. And going back to NIST framework, obviously because of this mapping, it gives a better ability to start connecting the dots and gives the opportunity for public companies to meet SEC requirements.
Yeah, agreed. And I think the question is well said because it also speaks to, especially here at Focal Point, how we've integrated our privacy and cybersecurity practice over the past year or so. Vendor risk management, vendor setup, typically privacy and compliance related, IDS and patch management. That is a cybersecurity discipline, right? So you need to have that inclusive look, the experience there to kind of work through all of those questions. But the framework itself, whether it's privacy related or the NIST cybersecurity framework, and those overlays absolutely would detail all of these particular controls that were asked. And then it really also becomes an exercise for the assessor, Focal Point or others, to know the right questions to ask, right? To make the framework do what we need it to do, right? From a holistic understanding of the organization, outline the controls that are out there and how they're operating. So another way to get there, regardless of who is asking the questions.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because from a control perspective, it's we have a client that we have the mapping, right, of each control. So is it SOX? Is it PCI? Is it HIPAA? Is it GDPR? Etc. In that way, if I had a privacy framework, I can just bring my privacy controls, and then I can immediately see how they map to SOX and the other requirements, right?
Exactly. Yeah, well, as we've seen, typically an organization won't provision access 6 or 7 different ways. They provision access one way, and there's different access levels that you're granted, but they do it one way. And so, that is a foundational, again, control that the organization has, regardless of what regulatory lens or the SEC or the SOX control perspective. That's how you do it, right? So we can manage to that, understand how that control or that collection of controls are operating, and then target some improvement around it. So it does absolutely make it more versatile.
And that's a good point, because I have a friend who works on the cyber side, right? And he says you can't do compliance on security. You can't just shove it, right? Because it's not going to work, right? Mm-hmm. It's the other way around, right? So from what you were just saying, it's interesting how compliance happens because you have the structure in place, right? It's not because, to your point, then I have clients where say, well, that's a SOX application, but it's not privacy application, right? Or on the other side, this is a private, this has PII, but it doesn't have SOX data. So therefore, from an IAM perspective, I don't have to meet the same controls, right?
Yep. And to the point, further about maturity versus the binary yes or no. Do you do identity and access management? Yes, we do. Do you do it everywhere? Well, no, we don't. Okay, well, then there's a maturity issue, right? Not that you don't have it, just that it's not fully implemented and configured the right way to support the compliance aspect of the challenge. So, yeah, it absolutely leads to better outcomes when you're able to take a look at everything holistically and then blend that approach out for remediation. Well, I believe we are just about at time. If there's no additional questions, I think we can close it up. We will be sending out the deck, I believe. If there's any additional questions, Danelle and my contact information will be included, so please let us know. Feel free to link in with us, and hope to continue the conversation with you all soon. Be well, be safe, be healthy, and thank you for joining.